You're listening to Drug Nonsense, the podcast exposing the falsehoods and sheer idiocy of the mainstream media's reporting about drugs. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the comeback episode of Drug Nonsense. I'm Emmanuel Spherius, and those of you who have been following my main podcast, Drug Positive, probably already know I got divorced about a year ago and took about a year off. That's why there haven't been any episodes released. Divorce is hard. I hope you never go through it unless you need to, which I did. And it's taken about this long for me to sort of get my life established in New Mexico now. I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and released this here episode for you about 1 year after our last episode. And I've released this one for free. I put this one in the main Drug Positive feed, so you're probably listening to this on iTunes or Google Play or something like that. Normally, this podcast is behind the Patreon paywall and only available to subscribers. We were, up to about $200 a month back when we were going strong. And then, of course, people dropped off when we took our hiatus. But now people are subscribing again, and so should you. It only costs $3, and then you have access to all the Drug Nonsense episodes. Hoping to put about one out every other week now, eventually, once we get sort of the systems established once a week. But for $3, you have access to all of them, past and future. And also, those of you who used to listen to Drug Nonsense probably know that my wife, now ex-wife, Tatiana, was my co-host, and she decided she didn't want to be involved anymore. And so I have found a new co-host who's sitting here with me right now. His name, just wait, his name is Mason Burks, and I met him when I moved out here to New Mexico. He is the director of the New Mexico chapter of DanceSafe. And, you know, there were a lot of people I was thinking about joining me as a co-host, but he stood out far above the rest. Mason is not only funny, intelligent, we have great conversations, so I'm really hoping that you like him. So here's the introduction, everyone. Ready? The new co-host of Drug Nonsense, my good friend, Mason Burks.
Hello. How's it going, everyone? I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. You know, so do you want to just say something about yourself?
Sure. As Emmanuel mentioned, I am the director of New Mexico DanceSafe. Prior to that, I was involved with a group called Students for Sensible Drug Policy.
SSDP?
SSDP.
They were born 1 year prior to DanceSafe. So we kind of are sister nonprofits that grew up together.
Absolutely. And almost immediately after I graduated from the University of New Mexico, I saw that DanceSafe was forming a chapter here in New Mexico. Perfect timing. Got on board. We began last August with about 5 folks, and now we are 17 members strong. We've serviced about 15,000 people in the New Mexico community, providing life-saving harm reduction services. And,
I love doing Meow Wolf shows.
Oh, absolutely.
Man, we saved so many people's lives there. God, some of those people would be dead if it wasn't for us being there. And I make jokes about that because, you know, I kind of think really what we're doing is we're sort of helping people find good drugs and avoid some of the pitfalls. But the truth is, not a lot of people dying from psychedelic use. I kind of think, though, that now that we're sort of involved in the whole fentanyl test strip business here, we probably are saving a lot more people's lives. But those probably more heroin and cocaine users.
Yeah. I mean, the life-saving services of fentanyl testing, of reagent checking at festivals are profoundly important, but at the same time, that's not the only thing that DanceSafe does. We are an active part of the community wherever we are, and we serve a really vital role in sort of taking care of the community as a whole in a cultural way, in fostering really good, practices as a community of taking care of each other, of taking care of yourself. Harm reduction isn't just reagents and fentanyl strips.
Yeah, and I also think it's about removing stigma, really. Like, we help people understand that they're okay for using drugs, and that actually does reduce drug abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so many of the harms that come about from substance use are because of stigma, of not being able to talk about it, of feeling a sense of shame that you might be putting on yourself, that you might be experiencing because your family, your friends, your you teachers, your coworkers are telling you that there's something wrong with this. And so it grows into this thing that gets roots and
it's a self-fulfilling
compromises.
prophecy.
Yeah. I mean, it's socially constructed. Everything is socially constructed. And we have to attend to that. We have an obligation to attend to that,
All right.
I mean, the thing that really got me involved in this community at all was when I was in 6th grade, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, and I was placed on Prozac and an antidepressant to treat that for 5 or 6 years. It didn't really do much at all for me, aside from, compromise the emotional stability of my life. And after a number of years, it was right before I graduated high school, I remember reading somewhere that psilocybin mushrooms were being used to treat obsessive compulsive disorder with really impressive sort of results. And so I found some, I took them for the first time with the intention of seeing if this would be something that could help me. And it really did. And I continue to take them, and they've, saved my life, honestly.
That's awesome. I think you told me that story once, but I had forgotten that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think a lot of Dance Safe volunteers and especially, chapter directors have had a positive experience with drugs. I mean, that's why I started Dance Safe, right? Because of my positive MDMA experiences. So that's awesome. Well, welcome to the show. I hope this is a long and fruitful relationship.
Absolutely.
So why don't we start out? What is the biggest news in drug nonsense in the media these days?
Well, the biggest thing is the state of South Dakota recently launched a anti-meth abuse advertising campaign. I don't know exactly what to call it, but it's been all over the internet lately because the tagline is "Meth, we're on it."
You've heard of this already. I mean, it's everywhere. Even the mainstream media is making fun of South Dakota. They have this video with all of these. Here, why don't we listen to it right now? Here it is, the South Dakota anti-drug PSA.
I'm on meth.
I'm on meth.
I'm on it too. So am I.
Meth is not someone else's problem. It's everyone in South Dakota's problem.
So that was it, everyone. The pro-drug, anti-drug South Dakota campaign. And, to honor South Dakota and this campaign, we decided to make this comeback episode of Drug Nonsense the stimulant episode. We got a number of articles coming up about cocaine we're going to talk about. And more importantly than that, Mason and I, during this episode right now, are on Adderall.
Adderall, we're on it.
We are on Adderall, everyone. Neither of us are prescribed it right now, so maybe technically we're breaking the law.
I can sense my family values draining away right now. Really can.
So you can write in and let us know if you think we're too high or if we're not making any sense right now. But anyway, the stimulant episode. Okay, so, the South Dakota campaign is it's funny, the entire corporate media is laughing at them, but it really, in a way, was a successful campaign to get attention just because of how it went viral. But the thing that really bugs me about this is it's so typical for the anti-drug types, the drug warriors, in trying to stop people from using drugs, they end up promoting drugs themselves. Look at the DARE program, right? It's like they're daring kids to use drugs.
Yeah, I mean, a police officer coming into your high school, holding up a bag saying, "This is so fun that people are going to tell you to do it. Don't do it."
That's really going to work.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people learn about drugs in a real personal way for the first time in these programs, and it's not providing a stable sort of foundation of people understanding that there are risks that can be mitigated. It's a overly dramatized, alienated from reality portrayal of drugs.
Did you go through the DARE program?
I did not. I believe it had sort of shown itself to be an absolute waste of time and money to a certain extent before I went through drug education. I did a brief week-long thing in middle school where we were required to make posters about how drugs are bad. I think mine had some really dumb pun about cannabis on it, but no, I never went through it.
I did when I was a kid. I went through the DARE program, and then I remember finding a bag of cannabis in my mother's drawer in her bedroom and calling her crying. because I thought that cannabis was such an evil thing, and I couldn't believe my mom had it, and that my mom laughs about it now, but it freaked the shit out of my parents. They're like, holy fuck. So they told me, oh no, that's not ours. We found that in a customer's pocket, because my parents owned a dry cleaners, right? We were about to call the police anyway. Like, they were so afraid that I was going to turn them in that they convinced me that they were about to call the police themselves. It wasn't really their cannabis or anything like that. Like, this is like how the drug war impacts, families.
Yeah. And the this initiative in South Dakota is doing the same sort of thing. I actually went to their website, and in a couple different segments, they're encouraging people to know the signs of methamphetamine use, but more problematically, to report people who they suspect are using methamphetamine. And in this weird drug warrior mentality, it's a coherent thought, but in as far as the way that families and communities actually function, a lot of these people in, rural or impoverished sort of communities are using substances because they're coping with the reality of living in a capitalist hellscape. And, the thing that'll really, really, really help people that are struggling with that is unending, universal paranoia that everyone they know and love is going to report them to the police.
That's certainly going to make their meth use much less problematic.
Absolutely. And this also reminds me of something that I became aware of not too long ago. There's an organization called RALLY. It stands for the RX Abuse Leadership Initiative. And they have programs that run all over the country. And the centerpiece of this program is a trailer that they have that's made up to resemble a teenager's bedroom. And when you go to these, let's call them trainings that they have, they teach you to look for signs of drug use in your children. But this is very explicitly telling people to spy on and surveil their own children as a way of remedying substance use, which is just incoherent. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think it's probably only going to make teenagers more clever in hiding these signs of their drug use so their parents can't find them. But it's definitely pitting parents against kids, making parents suspicious of their children's activities, and replicates the whole drug war culture again.
Absolutely. Bringing the drug war into our homes.
Reminds me of back in the late 90s during the DEA's anti-ecstasy campaign. The DEA released a list of behaviors to look for to tell whether your child is using ecstasy. And one of them, I kid you not, one of them was, if out of the blue they tell you that they love you.
Seriously?
Seriously. Like, God forbid your child tells you that they love you. They must be on drugs, right? And this sort of attitude is like, even back then in 1999, they couldn't deny that MDMA brings out feelings of empathy and love and compassion, et cetera, but they can't admit that it's real. And even as recently as 2015, I was down at the LA Rave Task Force where they were debating whether to allow festivals to happen on county property. And the police were there, and they put out a flyer, which was kind of made in conjunction with the harm reduction community. So it wasn't too bad, but they listed some of the effects of MDMA. And of course, they were all negative effects. They couldn't bring themselves to list any positive effects, because then they would think that they were promoting drug use, right? So you read the list and you're like, why would anyone use MDMA? Like, nausea, anxiety, right? But the one thing that they had to say that was a little bit positive on their flyer as an effect of MDMA was a false feeling of empathy and camaraderie. They had to claim that it was false, because of course, anything that you feel on a drug, except maybe Prozac or pharmaceutical drugs, like those produce real feelings, right? But MDMA produces only false feelings.
Yeah, the only real feelings of love and empathy you're allowed to have are, the kinds of things that they're trying to destroy by having you turn on your neighbors, your family, and your friends.
That's their world.
Yeah.
Right? We co-create our reality. We see the world through our own filters. Are we done with that?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. So what's the next big thing in the news in terms of drug nonsense these days? I think everyone has been hearing about it. And that is Joe Biden's refusal to support cannabis legalization until more evidence surfaces that it's not a gateway drug. It's everywhere, right? You heard it, right?
Absolutely. So it's really just kind of remarkable that he's managed to maintain this notion that gateway drugs exist, right? Cannabis is not a gateway drug. For most people that use cannabis, cannabis is an exit drug. People are using it in place of more problematic substances that are harder on your body, substances that have higher potentials for serious addiction. So it's just remarkable that in 2019, Joe Biden is trying to win votes by spouting off the same garbage the DEA was telling everyone to say, 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah. And, I just want to talk about the whole history of the notion of a gateway drug. Because there's really no such thing as a gateway drug. They came up with this concept purely as propaganda back in the 70s. And it came from interviews they did with heroin addicts or people with problematic heroin use. They just asked them, did you smoke marijuana in your life before doing heroin? And like 85% of them said, yeah. And then they drew this false conclusion that it's because they smoked the marijuana that they then, did the heroin, right? The whole gateway drug thing. But of course, that logic would also apply to bagels, right? Because I bet, 100% of those people had eaten a bagel at least once before they ever did heroin.
I don't know about 100%. Exactly. Some people are gluten intolerant. It's 2019. We have to be inclusive. You're excluding people.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. 99.9%. Watch your kids, everyone. Don't feed them bagels.
So something that's really connected to this is within the last number of days as of our recording of this, something called the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, passed a Senate Judiciary Committee. It's going to the House floor before too long. And this is intending to end marijuana prohibition in the United States on a federal level. And just to drive home how out of touch Joe Biden is with everyone and everything, even Kamala Harris, a former district attorney who put people in prison for a living, is in support of this bill. Joe Biden is the only Democratic candidate that is not in favor of marijuana decriminalization or legalization.
So
don't understand it.
Tell me more about the MORE Act. What does it stand for, and how does it differ between the States Act, which is also up in Congress right now?
So the MORE Act is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. It has provisions for expunging marijuana convictions from people's criminal records. It has provisions for releasing people from prison who are presently serving time for marijuana offenses. It includes I believe, 5% tax on marijuana sales, the proceeds from which will be reinvested in the communities most negatively affected by the drug war. And so this is honestly a relatively progressive cannabis reform bill compared to the kinds of things that have been put forward for years and years, and specifically compared to something called the States Act, which is being elevated as a preferable alternative by the Republican Party.
And so what's the basics of the States Act?
So the States Act stands for the Strengthening the 10th Amendment Through Entrusting States Act. So it doesn't include any sort of provisions for social equity, for expungement from criminal records. It does not include rescheduling cannabis. So cannabis would remain a federally scheduled substance. It is just sort of taking a step back from active enforcement and saying that states have the right and opportunity, and it is the state's place to make any sort of further legislative actions towards marijuana legalization. I mean, it's better than nothing, I guess, but at the same time, removing intentions and provisions for social equity from legislation like this is ignoring the fact that millions of people have had their lives ruined because of the drug war in the last decades. And saying states' rights is not going to help, It's interesting watching our federal government operate. It's hard to believe this isn't just pure racism, that the Republicans, especially under Trump, don't want to give any reparations to the black community, even ones much more recently victimized than, dating back to slavery, to divert some of the money in cannabis sales to help communities of color recover from the devastation of the CIA bringing crack cocaine into their communities, not to mention arresting and imprisoning maybe 1 million people for marijuana possession, is just rational. And when a lot of Republicans are criticized for not being more active as far as including social equity, a lot of them will defend their stance as, we'll just legalize it now, let the economic and market framework sort of grow up around that. And then later on, we can go back and we can adjust it and we can make tweaks for righting the wrongs that the government has done, which is just an excuse. They have no intention of actually addressing the grievances of the people that they've harmed. They just know that if they say that, people might believe them and let them pass through a bill that'll allow Ivy League college graduates to start cannabis dispensaries wherever they want.
It's all about the money.
It is all about the money.
Well, but so just today or yesterday, the MORE Act passed a committee and is heading to the full House where it's probably going to pass. But then the question is whether it's going to pass in the Senate. What do you think?
I would like to be hopeful. I think that, at this point, anyone who's opposing marijuana legalization specifically is just fighting the tide.
Well, Joe Biden certainly is.
Joe Biden certainly is.
And I really hope he doesn't get the nomination. I actually think he's the only candidate that could possibly lose to Donald Trump.
Yeah, and he's the guy who wrote the RAVE Act.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy Act that they used to shut down the rave culture.
And has remained to this day kind of a pain in the ass of dance safe.
Yeah, that's right. What's interesting about Joe Biden being the author of the RAVE Act is, first, I think he really was doing it to kiss up to the DEA because he had political aspirations. He probably wanted to be president one day, ended up being vice president, et cetera, right? But the other thing is that when the DEA started cracking down on the rave culture before the RAVE Act in 1999, this is right when I was starting Dance Safe, one of the first targets they picked was a promoter named Disco Donnie in New Orleans. And they tried to use the crack house laws in order to bust him, send him to prison. They lost. They ended up bankrupting him through the prosecution, and they did get his rave club shut down, but he never went to prison. And that's the reason why they wrote the RAVE Act, because they needed to expand the crack house laws to commercial venues, because using the crack house laws didn't work on Disco Donnie and a few other promoters. But here's the Joe Biden connection. Joe Biden's daughter at the time was a regular at Disco Donnie's raves in New Orleans. And she also suffered from problematic drug use, as well as some of Biden's other kids. And so what I think is really going on here, and why Biden is such a drug warrior, why he's such an anti-drug zealot, and make no mistake, he's as bad as any of the Republicans. He's worse than most of the Republicans around drug policy. The reason is because blaming the drug or blaming raves or picking any other scapegoat you can to blame your children's problematic drug use on, rather than understanding the family dynamics that lead into children developing problems with drugs, is just a lot easier. I mean, look at Joe Biden. He's a politician. He probably neglected his kids. There are aspects about him and his parenting and the family dynamics that he probably didn't want to look at. He just knew that his kids weren't doing well. Much easier to blame Disco Donnie, blame ecstasy, blame rave culture, etc. I think there's a personal reason that Joe Biden is such a drug warrior.
I did not know that.
It is absolutely true.
I can't believe this world. Honestly. All right. So the next story we're covering is from the Washington Post. The headline is "Why Abruptly Abandoning the Drug War is a Bad Idea for Mexico."
It's an editorial, at least, but it's the kind of thing the Washington Post would put out for sure. Isn't that owned by Bezos? Doesn't he own the Washington Post?
I would not be surprised.
God, reading this article sounds like something the CIA would put out. Honestly, who in their right mind these days is against ending the drug war, especially in Mexico, where tens of thousands of people are dying each year. 22,000 people died in 2018 from cartel violence or right-wing paramilitary violence.
Well, the people who are most against ending the drug war in Mexico are neoliberal billionaires who stand to gain a lot from maintaining the sort of infrastructural instability that exists in Mexico because of the drug war.
That's exactly right. I've actually done podcast episodes about how the drug war serves as cover for Western corporations to destabilize other countries that are resisting the takeover of their natural resources. We have a previous episode with Dawn Pauly. You should look it up on Drug Positive. She's the author of Drug War Capitalism, and that's what it's all about. She says there aren't even really cartels. They're just really right-wing paramilitary groups terrorizing the population, kidnappings, assassinations, etc., in order to allow the government to claim that it's actually drug war violence and not directed paramilitary violence to pave the way for Western corporations to come in and take over the resources of the country.
And we see this in a lot of places, not even specifically concerning the production of illegal drugs, right? In Colombia, there is a history of right-wing paramilitaries being paid by Coca-Cola assassinating union leaders.
Right.
And in places where the community has resisted that sort of strong-armed attempt at domination, those paramilitaries have expanded their tactics to just wholesale random murder of people in the streets.
Right. Right. All right. So let me give some quotes from this article, because it's like you can see the shallowness of her argument. Basically, here she says, here, quote, abruptly terminating the drug war is not the answer. The long and violent history of fighting drugs in Mexico runs too deep. Hurried demilitarization risks worsening an already precarious public security situation and ceding additional control to powerful criminal organizations. So essentially, we've militarized Mexico by pumping all this money into it to fight these cartels, and we ended up creating all this political violence. And now her argument is, well, we can't stop doing that because maybe for a short period, the violence is going to get worse. If that's not bullshit, I don't know what is. Here's another quote. Drug control was never a top priority of the Mexican government. America's developing drug war enhanced militarized policing in Mexico. But evidence suggests that Mexican political leaders used this aid to suppress domestic political dissent instead, which in time boosted the very groups trafficking drugs. Now, what she's saying here, in a way, is true, but she's disguising it. She's trying to say that we gave these $3 billion over the last 10 years to Mexico to fight drugs, and she's trying to claim that that was actually the U.S. government's intention, and that the Mexican government just fucked up. Instead of using it to fight drugs, they used it to, quote, suppress domestic political dissent. Well, that's exactly the reason the U.S. gave them the money in the first place, right? The domestic political dissent was against the right-wing government that was selling the country out to foreign corporations. So, here's this like blaming Mexico and saying, well, our drug war, our developing drug war is really a good thing. And the problem was that Mexico just didn't use the money right. Now they've got this problem with drug cartels, and we shouldn't stop the drug war because then those cartels will just consolidate their power. Some bullshit argument like that.
Remember, folks, violent acts on the part of right-wing paramilitaries generally are not flaws, they're features.
That's a good point. Very well said. And then, so here's the issue, really, and she says it in the last paragraph. And she's talking about Lopez Obrador, right, the current president of Mexico, who is suggesting that they decriminalize drugs in Mexico. She says, while his development initiatives make sense and offer a long-term solution, in the immediate term, the president must fuse them with use of his security forces, as well as the newly inaugurated 60,000-man National Guard, to maintain order with long-term development initiatives integrated gradually into the status quo. Now, if that's not saying directly that before you end the drug war, you need to use your military to assure that these long-term development interests continue, which happens to be the neoliberal program of selling the fucking country out to Western corporations. The honesty and transparency here in the last paragraph really is the kicker, right? She's saying, okay, if your paramilitaries can't keep the peasants down or are causing too many problems for you, then you better use your new National Guard to make sure that nobody rises up and protests U.S. hegemony in Mexico. Like, it's crazy to me how open and transparent she's being here. Well, thanks for letting me go off my soapbox there, Mason. This is really one of my main issues. And the latest episode of Drug Positive, in fact, is about this deep politics stuff. It's with the author Douglas Valentine. So if this isn't too frightening for you, if you're able to stomach it, you should definitely listen to the latest Drug Positive episode.
So the rest of our show is going to be about cocaine. On a much lighter note than U.S. imperialism in Mexico, does cocaine turn you into Spider-Man? Emmanuel, what do you think?
Well, who doesn't love cocaine? I love cocaine. I've never felt like I was Spider-Man on it, but I'm not 5 years old. And so that's actually what this article is all about. The headline is 5-year-old brings cocaine to class, says when he takes it, he feels like Spider-Man.
Well, I've never felt like Spider-Man when doing cocaine. Most of the time I've consumed it, I want to get into a really heated argument about French post-structuralism, but I don't think that's a typical response. So,
well,
revealing my character here.
We are on Adderall right now, but it's been 30 years since I was a philosophy student, so I don't even know what post-structuralism is anymore. That's that postmodernist stuff, right?
Yes, I'm a postmodern neo-Marxist, and I'm proud of it.
All right, we'll get into that eventually. So, what I don't like about this article here, this toddler brought a small bag of cocaine into Lawrence Elementary School in
Holyoke, New York.
Holyoke, Massachusetts.
Massachusetts.
Right.
All right.
And there's no evidence that the child ingested the cocaine at all. So we have this headline that suggests that he did. And of course, this goes viral. It was everywhere. Maybe you saw it. Literally, there were 24 articles that I saw about this incident, right? And, the father was dealing cocaine and had these baggies around the house, and his toddler got into it. And no one's defending that. Like, he should have had his cocaine in a safe. You should not let a toddler get into the cocaine. But the baggies of cocaine themselves actually had Spider-Man on it. So I think what's really going on here is the child said that when he has why are you holding this bag of cocaine? Because it makes me feel like Spider-Man. That's what a toddler is going to say, right? There's no evidence that the toddler actually took the cocaine.
Yeah. Shoes with lightning bolts on them make you run faster. Everyone knows that. So,
right. So, this is the kind of story that gets perpetuated in the media because it scares people. You think, what a horrible father. You think, oh my God, a child taking cocaine.
Look at the state of our world.
Exactly.
Okay, so next story. Feral hogs tear through $22,000 worth of cocaine in Italy.
Wild boars in Italy digging up cocaine, right? The police had tapped the phones of these coke dealers and heard this, and then I guess they published it in the police report. And one of the stories that's just has to go viral, right? Because it is funny. This is funny. Yeah. Are we criticizing this media for this story? I don't know. It's funny. Pigs doing coke. Why would pigs do coke?
To feel like Spider-Man, obviously. I feel like the pigs had a lovely day.
I would.
Spider pig does whatever a spider pig does.
Yeah.
Can he swing from a web? No, he can't, because he's a pig. Look out, it's Spider Pig. Okay, I'm done.
What else can we say about this story? I guess wild boars, according to the story, they are a nuisance in Italy. And so there's so many of them around. And, they do dig out truffles, right? They're able to sniff really deep in the ground, So I guess we just sort of give some advice to coke dealers in Italy. Don't bury your coke anymore because these pigs like it. What's next?
So next story is cocaine treasure hunters warned off French beaches. About 760 kilos of very high quality cocaine have been washing up on multiple beaches in France. The government has been adamantly warning people not to go near them. There are helicopters circling around trying to dissuade people from going by. A number of people have wandered on these beaches saying, "Oh, I didn't know that this was happening. I was just going for a walk."
One of our episodes on Drug Positive is Dance Safe, Ketamine, and Counterfeit Cocaine. And we're live recording when we were testing for people, and someone brought a ground score in, and it was a huge bag of cocaine. So we called it the lucky ground score, So he found it. He wasn't actually a treasure hunter, but I'd love to be a treasure. I grew up in Florida, walking the beaches a lot. I've never found a brick of cocaine.
Well, as our climate crisis worsens and hurricanes happen more and more frequently, it might be something worth getting into. Maybe every other weekend there will be a hurricane bringing 760 kilos of cocaine to a beach near you. So
the article did say that Hurricane Dorian in September actually brought some of the exact same cocaine onto Florida beaches. So maybe climate change is going to increase free drugs for people.
It might be the only benefit. And so following this windfall of cocaine coming up on beaches in France, the French government has warned people, and I quote, "It's a very pure product that must not be consumed in this form because there is a very high risk of overdose." France.
What was the purity? Did they mention it?
Mentioned 83%.
83% pure cocaine?
I mean, people refer to 83% pure cocaine, and sometimes that is not quite accurate because technically, cocaine that is not freebase, cocaine hydrochloride, is 17% by weight, like hydrochloride salt. So it might have been.
Oh, well, that's
pure
pure
cocaine.
Get. Oh, never do that, everyone.
Never do that. No. And then immediately following this warning about the purity of cocaine, they've informed beachgoers that there is a 10-year prison sentence that goes along with possession of this quantity of cocaine.
The picture they had on the article showed 25 people, all with their heads down, spread out over this beach, like they were all looking to find the cocaine. All right, so we'll end with a more serious cocaine story. This headline reads, "Death toll from tainted cocaine rises." And, before we critique the nonsense in it, the one thing I do like about it is that it is accurately reporting that fentanyl is the main reason so many more people are dying from doing cocaine these days. When we, Dance Safe, released our Coke Challenge video, and you should Google a Coke Challenge and go see it, to warn people to test their cocaine using our fentanyl testing strips. A lot of people wrote in disbelieving it was true. They thought it was just government propaganda, kind of the same way that police are saying that fentanyl is contaminating the marijuana supply. And we know that's not true. That's just all drug war nonsense. But it actually is contaminating the cocaine supply. And so you really do, if you use cocaine these days, you really do need to buy some fentanyl testing strips from dancesafe.org and test it first.
And one of the most nonsensical things about this is that nowhere in this article do they even discuss the fact that fentanyl test strips are available, that they can make a very big difference ensuring people aren't consuming contaminated cocaine like this, right? They're not putting forward any sort of solution. They're not articulating any sort of way that we can address specific problems and save real human lives. They're just trying to make everyone scared.
Yeah, it's par for the course. It's the same thing when articles come out talking about PMA or counterfeit MDMA tablets that end up killing people. They never say that there are reagent kits that you can use to avoid the counterfeit drugs. They just use it as an anti-drug tactic.
Because they're not in the business of saving lives. They're in the business of putting people in prison.
Well,
right?
They're journalists, and you would think they would want to be helpful, right?
One would think.
Yeah. Yeah, and they always love to talk about Russian roulette, and this article does it, right? They quote someone who says, "Doing cocaine these days is equivalent to playing a game of Russian roulette," right? I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, right? They take the adulterated, contaminated drug markets, which are caused by prohibition itself, and then they use that to try to claim why you shouldn't use drugs, instead of acknowledging that if we regulated drugs, if we decriminalized, we could improve the situation.
Yeah, they pretend that adulteration is just this thing that's a natural part of drugs as a class and that it's not the immediate traceable result of prohibition.
Absolutely.
And just to tie this back to what we spoke about in reference to South Dakota's meth campaign and their insistence on encouraging people to turn in their friends and family for even suspected substance use, a lot of the people that are interviewed in this article are in Ohio, and the Hamilton County Heroin Coalition has a quick response team, the intention of which is to address folks who have problematic substance use and supposedly help them through recovery, but a significant number of people that are part of this response team are police officers, which I really don't understand how in any conceivable way police officers could be helping people through this process of recovery. This article says that they often show up at people's homes to try and get them into treatment. Now, making treatment available is important, but having police show up and coerce people into treatment programs and facilities is not respecting people's autonomy. It's just further criminalizing substance users.
Yeah, police have no business at all dealing with drugs. Drugs is a health issue, and if police show up at your door to try to help you, I would be suspicious of that. There's this implicit threat there. You're going to go to jail. I'm a cop. That's what cops do. They're there to enforce laws, right?
This is not any different than stop and frisk. They say that they're checking on people because they're concerned about their health and they want to get them into treatment programs, but what they really do is intentionally over-police already vulnerable and already oppressed communities of people.
Right.
Absolutely.
How are you feeling?
Pretty good.
You feel the Adderall?
Yes, I do. Do you?
I absolutely do. Okay. All right. Like this was kind of our first episode. Mason, did you enjoy it?
Oh, absolutely. I've never been on a podcast before, and it's definitely quite a learning experience.
I do a lot of editing. I mentioned that to you. The audience might not know. Like, we've been doing this for an hour and 15 minutes. So there's a lot of like outtakes that I'm going to cut out.
There are a lot of really not funny non sequiturs that I blurted out that totally derailed the conversation. And unfortunately, no one gets to know what those are but Emmanuel.
That's right. So we're going to do it again?
Absolutely.
Yep, I'll come down to Albuquerque. We'll record your place. So between now and then, check out the news and save articles that contain a lot of nonsense.
Absolutely. I specialize in nonsense. So
thanks for listening, everyone. This is Drug Nonsense. And again, head over to patreon.com and search for Drug Positive. And that's where you'll find all of our Drug Nonsense episodes.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.